my dear students. Welcome back to biology class. Today we are continuing with the first chapter, that is the living world. And today we are going to study about diversity in the living world. Now you know that when you look around yourself, you can see varieties of plants and animals, varieties of living organisms. So many different types of plants you see, so many varieties of animals, okay, and not only that, you also know that even though we don't see them, but there are so many unicellular organisms around us. So we are surrounded by so many varieties of living organisms. Now if you increase the area of study, okay, for example, you just go out and when you start seeing, you see there are so many different more varieties of plants and animals. So when you increase the area, you see that the list of the plants and animals we see, also the list go on increasing. Now imagine you get into a dense forest. So when we study the living organisms there, so obviously we can see much more greater varieties of plants and animals. So when we take the whole earth into consideration, we say that almost there are 1.7 to 1.8 million types of living organisms. Okay, so every organism or every plant what we see, it will indicate a particular species. So like that, there are so many species of living organisms on this earth, and we say it's approximately 1.7 to 1.8 million types of living organisms on this earth. So to refer this, we use a word biodiversity. So what is biodiversity? It is nothing but the number and types of living organisms present on the earth. We call it as biodiversity. So it will represent the varieties, the number and different types of living organisms on this earth. So that is biodiversity. Now since I told you there are so many million types of living organisms on this earth, now so many animals, now when we just look around, we can recognize some particular plants and animals. We know their names, but the names what we know, it's usually the local name what we use for a particular plant or a particular animal. So these local names, it varies from region to region. Okay, so for example, if you take the whole country into consideration, we have so many different languages in our country, and from one part to the other, different region to region, the same animal or the same plant will have so many different names. Okay, in one state they call it in a different name, in the other state another name. So all these local names, we know them by the local names. If you take the whole world into consideration, different countries have their own language, and as I told, a particular animal or a particular plant, it has so many local names. But these local names will create a lot of confusion for the communication. So if the biologists have to communicate with each other about a particular organism, if they have to refer a particular organism, using a local name would be very difficult. It becomes, it's not proper, it becomes a problem for the communication. So one thing has to be done, that is local names fine for the local usage, but a standard name has to be given for every plant or an animal. Okay, so that procedure of giving a standard name, so that standard name should be, that name should be universal. So all over the world, the biologists have to recognize a particular animal or a particular plant by that particular single name. So that standard naming or giving a standard name for a particular plant or animal, we say it as nomenclature. So nomenclature is nothing but it is the method of giving a standard name for any living organism. Now, if we have to give a standard name for a particular plant or an animal, before that the first initial step is identification. Okay, first that particular organism, it has to be identified properly, it has to be identified so that the naming can be done. So for nomenclature, one important step is identification. So identification of the organism or a plant or an animal becomes very important for naming an organism. So nomenclature and identification of an organism. Now when we say standard naming, biologists all over the world, they wanted to make it much more easier for naming and all that. So they developed standard principles or standard rules. Okay, so for example, for a plant, if a plant has to be named, it has to be according to the principles and rules or the criteria of a standard ICBN. Now what is this ICBN? It is International Code So ICBN, so the naming of the plant, any plant all over the world, okay, so the standard naming or giving a scientific name for the plant will be according to the rules or the principles of ICBN, that is International Code for Botanical Nomenclature. Now this is about plants. Now what about animals? For animals, again we have different rules, okay, for the nomenclature. It is ICZN. Now what is ICZN? International Code International Code for Zoological Nomenclature. So when an animal has to be named, given a standard name, it has to be according to the rules and criteria of ICZN, that is International Code for Zoological Nomenclature. So according to this, the naming, standard naming of any organism throughout the world will be done. Now, this scientific name will ensure that one animal or one particular plant has only one standard name throughout the world, and that name should not be repeated for any other animal or any other plant. So one particular organism will have one standard name which will be followed or which will be identified throughout the world. Now that is about ICBN and ICZN. Now let's study about the standard procedure, how the naming is done, scientific naming is done. So at present we follow binomial nomenclature. So binomial nomenclature is a standard method which we follow right now for naming, that is to give a scientific name for plants and animals. Now what is binomial nomenclature? It's a method of naming an organism where the name will consist of two components. So the scientific name. So this binomial nomenclature, it's a method of giving a scientific name for any plant or animal where the name consists of two components. The name consists of two components. The first component or the first word we call it as generic name. So the name of any organism will consist of two components. So this method of giving scientific name, we call it as binomial nomenclature, where the scientific name will have two components. First component is called generic name and second component is called specific epithet. Okay, this is about binomial nomenclature. So it's a scientific method of naming an organism where the name consists of two components. First component we call it as generic name and second component we call it as specific epithet. Okay, now this method of naming a living organism, that is binomial nomenclature, it was actually put forth by a scientist named Carolus Linnaeus. So he was a scientist. Carolus Linnaeus was a scientist who actually put forward this method of naming the living organism, which we call as binomial nomenclature. Now with an example, let's study what is binomial nomenclature. Now this is a scientific name of potato, that is Solanum tuberosum. Now here you can observe that the name of potato, the scientific name of potato has two words, that is Solanum is the first component, tuberosum is the second component. Now in this, the first component, that is Solanum, this becomes the generic name. Okay, this is the first component and this is generic name. Tuberosum, this is the second component, which is specific epithet. So you can see it very clearly. The scientific name of potato, that is Solanum tuberosum, two components are there. This is generic name and this is specific epithet. Now like this, if you take up any other organism, for example mango, mango's scientific name is Mangifera indica. So here also you will see that the name of mango, scientific name of mango is Mangifera indica, which has two components. This is the genus name or the generic name and indica is specific epithet. So this generic name we can also say it as genus name. That's in a common words we use. I call it as genus name. Specific epithet, it can be also called as species name. So you take up any organism on the earth, the scientific name will have two components. So that is with the example. Now I think all of you are clear with what is binomial nomenclature. Okay, so it was Carolus Linnaeus who actually put forward this method of naming the living organism. Now this binomial nomenclature, it has certain rules. Okay, so now let's move on to that and study what are the rules of binomial nomenclature. So, naming of an organism with the two names which we call as binomial nomenclature, it has certain rules. So, let's see what are the different rules. So, the first rule says that biological name or the scientific name of an organism, it has to be in Latin. It has to be in Latin. So, it may be originated from whichever, but it has to be Latinized or it should be in Latin. So, that is the first rule of binomial nomenclature. Then, the second rule says that the name of any organism should have two components. So, that is what we studied here also. This is one of the rule which says that the name of the organism should have two components. Okay. So, name have two components where the first component is genus name, or we can say generic name, and the second component is specific epithet. Okay, so this is the second rule where it says the name should have two components, that is genus name, that is first component is genus name and second component is species name, or we call it as specific epithet. Okay, then the next rule says that if we are writing the scientific name, so when scientific name is handwritten, okay, so if we are writing the scientific name, the two components, the genus name and the species name, okay, so the two components, it has to be underlined separately. Okay, so if you just observe here, I have followed that here. See, I have written the scientific name, Solanum tuberosum, and both the components are underlined separately. So that is what the third rule says, that when we are writing it, when it is handwritten, the names are handwritten, two components has to be underlined separately. Okay, so it has to be underlined separately. You can't put a single line like this, but two components has to be underlined separately. That is the third rule. But what about if you are typing the name? Okay, so when it is typed, during typing we see that the font changes to italics. Okay, so if we are printing, if we are typing the name of any plant or animal, when we are typing the scientific name, the font has to be changed. Only for the name, for the genus name and for the species name, the font has to be changed to italics. Okay, so this is followed when the name is typed or during printing. We see that it is the font is changed. When it is changed to italics, there is no need for underlining. Underlining is done only when it is handwritten. When it is printed, we see that the font is changed to italics. Then the next rule says the first component, that is the genus name. Genus name always starts with capital letter. Okay, so it says that genus name always starts with capital letter. So if you can see here, see this is a capital letter I have used. So genus name always starts with capital letter. What about species name? Species name we should not start it with the capital letter, but it has to start with the small letter. Okay, so this rule says that the genus name always starts with capital letter. So you can observe here for the example what I have written on the board. The first component, genus name starting with the capital letter. See, here also I have started with the capital letter, whereas species name should always start with the small letter. See, here also I have started with the small letter. So this is a rule of binomial nomenclature. Then one more thing, it says after the species name. Okay, after the species name, the author's name has to be written in abbreviated form. Okay, so in abbreviated form means in the short form. For example, Mangifera indica. Okay, after this we write like this, Lin. So this is the author's name, and always author's name has to be written after the species name. So after species name, when you write this, it means that this Lin is the short form of Carolus linnaeus, and it means that this was the author who first described about this plant. So the next rule says that we have to write the author's name in an abbreviated form after the species name. So these are the different rules of binomial nomenclature, and this can be a 5 marks question. Now we have finished with binomial nomenclature. So you know that every organism on this earth is given a standard scientific name. Now it's practically not possible to study each and every organism on this earth. So to make this study a bit easier, what is done is organisms which have lot of similarities, they are grouped. Okay, so based on the similarities, they are made into groups, so which makes study a bit easier. So that grouping of organism based on these similarities, we call it as classification. So classification, it may be in different rankings. Now for example, when I say about a word plant, when I say plant, each one of you will think about different plants. So immediately what comes to your mind is some plant. It may not be common, but everybody will think of one or the other plant. Okay, so when I say plant, you know the general characters of plant. So you will know that it has leaves, it has stem, it grows in soil or in water, it has roots. So all the general characters you know. When I say animals, each one of you will think of different animals, but all of you will think about the group animal. Now in plants, okay, for example, as I told, we'll take example of plants and animals. Now I told plant, as I told, all of you thought about one or the other plant. Now I will say you wheat plant. Okay, so when I say wheat plant, immediately all of you will imagine a wheat plant. Now in animals, it's a huge group. When I say animals, it may be any animal which comes to your mind. Some of you may think of a tiger, some of you may think of a lion, some may think of a dog, okay, or a cat, any animal. Okay, now in animals, I specify, I use the word, all of you think about mammals. Now when I say mammals, again each one of you will think of different mammals. So you know, when I say mammals, you look for some general characters, like they have body hairs, external ears. Okay, so all those are the general characters of mammals, and each one of you will think of different types of mammals. Now when I say all of you just think about a dog. So each one of you, clearly all of you will think about a dog. Now, if you see, classification can be done. Now see, this is a grouping what we have done. Now this is a big group. It's a big group called as animals, which include mammals, which includes reptiles, which includes birds, different types of animals. But when I say mammals, we are speaking specifically of that one group. Now in mammals, when I say dog, we are again specifically speaking about only that particular group of animals which we call as dog. So here you will see we have classified animals. And you can also observe that classification, when we see, it is in different rankings. Okay, this is a different ranking of classification. Okay, the big group which we call as animals, in that group, one group called as mammals. Why we put the animals in one group called as mammals? It is based on the similarities. Now when we say reptiles, we put certain group of animals into that particular group, again based on the similarities. When they have lot of similar characters, we put them in one group. Same thing we have done here. So during classification, you will see that the organism will occupy a particular ranking, or classification can be, in classification we see different rankings. Okay, this different rankings we call it as taxa. Okay, so in a common term we say different rankings, different position. Okay, so the scientific word, okay, in science we use the word taxa. So taxa will represent a particular category or a particular ranking. So that is the term we use during classification. The different rankings we call it as taxa. Okay, now different organism, as I told, based on the characteristics, the living organisms are classified, okay, in different groups, and this study we call it as taxonomy. Okay, so the living organisms, they are characterized into different groups, and the study we call it as taxonomy. Okay, so taxonomy, when we say or to group, the grouping of different plants and animal is done, and the grouping will be based on, now to see the similarity, what are the criteria, what are the characters we look for. You know that we consider the external characters of the organism, internal character of the organism, cell structure. Okay, so all this we will consider during evolution, different chemicals within the plants, within the animals, all that is considered for taxonomy. Okay, so taxonomy, when we say, it is not a something, it's not new, it's not a new subject. Even in early days, okay, in early days, human beings, now if you think of human beings in early days, you know that what was the necessity? It was the only basic things, like they needed food, they needed shelter. So they were in search of the basic needs of life. So even during at that time, taxonomy do existed, that is classification used to take place, but that classification was based on their uses. There was no scientific knowledge at that time, but depending on their use, for what purpose they are using. So based on that basic thing, they used to classify plants and animals. As human lot of education, that is lot of scientific information as they get, human beings they became like very curious to know not only about all the different organisms, but about the relationship. Okay, so the relationships between the living organism, between one species and the other, is there any relationship? They were very interested or curious to know about the relationships between different species, and this made the entry of a new subject which we call as systematics. Okay, so systematics will be the study of the living organism, okay, based on the relationship. What is the relationship between the species? So when we study evolution, we get to know that so many species are related to each other. So that evolution, study of this evolution and study of the relationship between the living organism, between one species to the other, we call it as systematics. So this word systematics is derived from a Latin word, that is systema. Okay, so this is a Latin word, systema, from which this word is derived. So it means the classification of these organisms based on the relationships between the species. Okay, so Carolus Linnaeus has published a book named Systema Naturae. Okay, so this is the book published by Carolus Linnaeus, that is Systema Naturae. So systematics became a branch which deals with study of the relationships between the different species, okay, when we study of the evolution. So during evolution we have to study to know the relationship between the living organisms. Okay, so that is about the systematics. So we get a clear picture about today what all we studied, that is binomial nomenclature, the rules of binomial nomenclature, and about the classification and about the taxonomy and systematics. Okay, so let's stop at this point. Okay, we'll continue this chapter in the next session. Thank you.